Today we're going to talk about the concept of a leadership agenda. You know, there's lots of books about leadership, lots of speakers on leadership, and the topic, you can see it everywhere. Different people have different approaches to leadership. There are theories of leadership that dates back to Plato and even further back. But I'm going to give you a slightly different view of leadership. In fact, I'm going to start with a provocative claim. See, I believe that leadership cannot be taught. I believe that leadership cannot be learned. And I believe that leadership cannot be imitated. Permit me to say that one more time. I believe that leadership cannot be taught, leadership cannot be learned, leadership cannot be imitated. So what am I suggesting? Am I suggesting that when babies are born, you do a little DNA test and figure out if it's a leader or not? No, I'm not suggesting that it is innate, that it is inborn. No, you see, I think leadership has to be developed. Now the cynic would ask, well, what's the difference between learned and developed? Is that just a matter of semantics? Not really. There's a significant difference, and I want to explain that difference using a metaphor. Imagine you had a child, a young child, let's say 5 years old, a little girl. Maybe your daughter, a 5-year-old child, let's say it's your daughter, and you have taken your 5-year-old daughter to Disneyland, and you're taking her to one of those Fantasyland rides, Peter Pan. There you are, standing in line, long lines. She's standing there right next to you with great anticipation, excitement. She can't wait to get to the front of the line. About an hour or so later, you finally get to the front of the line, and that chair comes along. This 5-year-old child who so patiently and so with excitement and anxiousness has waited till a whole hour to get to the front of the line. When that chair finally comes along, she's all nervous now. She's not sure about this ride. She holds on to dad or mom real tight. And you get in the chair, and the chair takes off. For that 5-year-old child, that chair actually took off. For that 5-year-old girl, she is flying in the land of Peter Pan. She's forgotten that she's on a ride. She is so immersed. It's really happening. Now you and I sitting next to her, we know that these are all on rafters, these are all just posters. But for that 5-year-old child, she is flying through the land of Peter Pan, imagining a whole story going on in her head. This whole story where these characters are talking to her in this story is true and real for her at that moment. This whole story is going on in that child's head. I don't know what's beautiful. The next chair, a different child with his or her mom or dad, that child is going through the same ride, has a story in his or her head, that child's head, but a totally different story. Not the same story. Even though the ride is the same, the stimuli are the same characters, but they invoke a whole different story in that child. This child might go back to wherever they came from. They could tell their friends about Disneyland, the resort, the rides, but they could never describe that story that was going on in their head through the ride of Peter Pan's land. Why do I go into this detail about a silly ride of a Disneyland ride? Well, because that ride is embedded in that child's head. It is the image that little girl has of the Peter Pan ride. That is what leadership is like. It is a story that's going on in your head as I speak. It is a story that's in your head based on the ride you have taken in life. A ride that you've taken in your personal life, in your professional life. That ride has caused a story in you. And that story is unique to you. Others who have gone through the same ride, live next door to you, maybe worked in the same industry as you, they're taking a ride. You might think it's the same market, same economy, but their story is very different. You have a whole story based on the ride you've taken. Unlike that 5-year-old child on the Disneyland ride, in the Peter Pan ride, you are immersed in your ride. You have never actually stepped out of that ride and looked at yourself and asked, what is that story that's going on in my head? You have never stopped to ask that question. That story is your leadership story. It is, in fact, a story. You see, it's a story in that it's got a plot, it's got people, it is a whole story you have developed in your life. And unbeknownst to you, that story is driving your leadership. And it's not the same story. Every person has a different story. So when I say leadership cannot be learned or taught, but needs to be developed, it's that story that you've got to create intentionally. See, you are a unique kind of leader. There's nobody like it. Your style of leadership is different than everybody else. Be yourself. Everybody else is taken. In case you don't know, that's an Oscar Wilde quote. Be yourself. You see, the word learn is a wrong word, in my opinion, to describe leadership. I'll tell you why. When you use the word learn, when I want to learn yoga, the immediate assumption one makes is that somebody already knows yoga. So you go find this person who knows yoga and they teach it to you. The moment you say learn, that is the model that our brain creates. Let's go find the person who knows it. So when you say learn leadership, you are immediately looking for that person to teach you. The word learn and teach make an implicit assumption that it already exists. In contrast, the word develop has a very different implicit assumption. It suggests it doesn't exist. It suggests that it's got to be created. When you shift your thinking of leadership from that of learning it to that of developing it, you begin to undertake upon yourself a personal responsibility for creating this thing called my style of leadership. When you shift your thinking of leadership from that of learning it to that of developing it, you undertake a personal responsibility for its creation, pride in that created entity, and a lifelong commitment to practicing that style of leadership. That is what I mean by leadership has to be developed. So on the one hand, I claim you cannot teach, learn, or imitate leadership. You have to develop it. On the other hand, I'm going to suggest to you that I can spot leadership. I can spot it. In fact, I can give you a test for leadership. A test, as in apply the test and see if somebody's a leader. I know, I suspect you are very skeptical. You don't believe such a test could exist. I'm going to give you this test. I'm going to give you this test. But you know what we'll do? I want you to think of some names of famous leaders so that when I give you the test, you can apply it on the famous leaders and see if it works. I want you to think a bunch of names of famous leaders. If you'd like to stop this video, Write down some names of famous leaders. And people like Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, Martin Luther King Jr., Mother Teresa, Mahatma Gandhi. Give a whole bunch of names of leaders. Even throw in leaders like, Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin. And then we'll apply the test and see if it works. Test for leadership. Here's the test. L cubed. Leadership equals leverage plus legacy. Let me explain this equation. See, leaders influence others. Leaders influence others to act differently. Leaders influence others to think differently. Leaders influence others to behave differently. That's how they contribute. Leaders contribute by causing others around them to think, act, and behave differently than they might have had that leader not been present. That's how leaders contribute. Unlike individual contributors, let's take some examples of individual contributors. People who do some work that others value. And let's take a variety of them. My wife is an artist. She's a painter. So a painter, an individual contributor. A cook who cooks meals. A truck driver who drives a truck from here to there. An accountant. These people are all individual contributors. They contribute where the painter paints something. That's how the painter contributes. The painting is that person's contribution. The cook cooks up meals. The truck driver drives a truck from point A to point B. That's the truck driver's contribution. The accountant keeps the books. In contrast to these individual contributors, the leader contributes differently. The leader contributes by causing the painter to think, act, and behave differently than if the leader hadn't been there. By being there, they affect the behavior of the painter such that the painter's contribution is changed, is affected. That changed contribution is actually the leader's influence. So leaders contribute by influencing the painter and thereby modifying the painter's contribution, hopefully enhancing the painter's contribution, enhancing it by 10, 20, 30%. The extra 30% they got out of the painter, that is actually the leader's contribution. The leader influenced the painter and extracted an extra 30% out of the painter. But the leader didn't influence just the painter. The leader also influenced that cook and extracted an extra 30% out of that cook as well. The leader also influenced that truck driver and that accountant. And so the leader's contribution then is that extra 30% times the number of people they influenced. That is leverage. You see, some leaders influence not just tens or hundreds or even thousands of people. Some leaders influence hundreds of thousands of people, 1 million people, 1 billion people sometimes. Those leaders, their contribution then is that extra 30% times 1 billion. Great leaders have high leverage. Great leaders influence a lot of people in the world to think, act, and behave differently than they might have had that leader not been present. But sometimes that leader's presence modifies the behavior of people, but modifies it in a negative way. To wit, Adolf Hitler. Did Adolf Hitler influence people? Absolutely he did. Did the influence create positive or negative value? Undoubtedly negative value. Was he a great leader? I hate to say it. Yes, he was a great leader. He did awful things with that great leadership qualities. But he did influence a lot of people. That negative number got multiplied by such a large number that his contribution turned out to be horrendously bad. But fortunately, most of the good leaders that we see are ones that create a positive contribution. Great leaders have high leverage. They influence a lot of people in the world to think, act, and behave differently than they might have if the leader had not been present. They influence a lot of people. Legacy is the same concept, but it is over time. You see, the leader's influence, back to the painter that we were talking about, the leader influenced the painter. The leader's influence on the painter occurs not only during the time that the leader is physically present amidst the painter, but often long after the leader has come and gone. So the painter's enhanced 30% contribution occurs not only now when the leader is right there, but it occurs again the next year when the leader is gone. Occurs again the year after, and the year after. So the leader's total contribution then is that extra 30% times the number of people they influenced times the length of time over which they influenced them. And that is legacy. Great leaders have long legacy. Their influence lasts a long, long time, long after they've come and gone. Great leaders have high leverage, long legacy. They influence a lot of people. The influence lasts a long, long time. That is a test for leadership. Apply that test. Apply that test on the famous leaders you had in mind. You know, an Abraham Lincoln, a George Washington, a Martin Luther King Jr., a Mahatma Gandhi. Did all these people influence a lot of people in the world to think, act, and behave differently? Did that influence last a long, long time? Apply that test on names of leaders you have in mind. That might be your personal acquaintances, people you admire locally within your own industry where you think they're a great leader. See if they are influencing others. Apply that leadership on yourself, that test on yourself. Are you influencing others? Will that influence last after you're gone? That is why I tell leaders that all leaders should have a written leadership agenda. A leadership agenda. A short, hopefully one-page statement of your style of leadership. A leadership agenda is a very powerful concept. It forces you to become an intentional leader. It forces you to say, this is the way I wish to lead. It is not about learning somebody else how to lead. It is about you being intentional about how you wish to lead. To create a leadership agenda, it's not easy, by the way. Significant amount of work. You have to ask yourself, what is my leadership style? Lots of people think they know their style. All they are capturing is the what I call motherhood and apple pie of leadership. You know, empowering leader. Those words don't make you unique. Ask yourself, how can I describe my style so clearly that if it was one of 20 little chits of paper written, shaken in a hat, in a room full of 20 people that know each other, when mine is drawn and read out loud, Everybody in the room would say, oh yeah, that's that guy. Can you be that clear about your leadership style? You should be, to write a leadership agenda, you must be intentional about your leverage and your legacy. Who do you wish to influence? How do you wish to influence them? How long do you wish for that influence to last? Who do you wish to influence? How do you wish to influence them? How long do you wish for that influence to last? To write a leadership agenda, you must be clear about your leadership brand. How do others perceive you? How do others perceive you? And you should be clear about your leadership culture. What about you do people need to know to understand you and your leadership? All of this goes into a leadership agenda. The power of leadership agenda is immense. It makes you an intentional leader. I've had mine for 26 years. I've talked about my leadership agenda to people all over the place. It makes you an intentional leader. Leadership cannot be taught, learned, or imitated. It has to be developed. But you can test for it. Leverage and legacy. And in order to pass that test, you must be very clear about your style of leadership. And the way you get there is by writing a leadership agenda. Think about it. Do you have your leadership agenda?